Hello and good evening. I'm Abigail Carter-Simpson and welcome to the first of a series of webinars entitled Global Investigations, Team, Tradecraft and Tech, brought to you by Prevail Intelligence Sanctuary. This is going to be the first of 4 webinars in the series, and the next hour intends to be informal, no PowerPoints, focusing on fireside chat style discussions. So now we're all here, let's start. I'm joined by 2 of the co-founders. We have Jonathan Benton, former Met Police Senior Investigator and Head of UK International Corruption Unit. He's widely respected within the financial crime and investigative industry. It's great to see you, Jonathan.
Great to see you too, Abby. Thank you.
Next, we have Damien Huntingford Obe, who has a specialist military background, former commanding officer of the Special Boat Service. Hello, Damien.
Hey, good evening, Abby, and hello, everyone.
Brilliant. We're delighted to have a special guest on this first webinar, Sarah Wood, barrister with 5 St Andrews Hill. Good evening, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you for having me.
So now everyone's been introduced, let's begin. So this first webinar is entitled Complex Investigations in Uncertain Times. To begin with, I think we'd all like to hear about the story behind your company, Prevail Intelligence Sanctuary, just to properly set the context for more technical discussion of the issues. It sounds like you've both had very interesting previous careers. Jonathan, perhaps you'd like to begin.
Thank you, Abby. Hi and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. So for those that don't know me, as explained, I'm former law enforcement. The team that I'm privileged to work with are largely former law enforcement type environment, and we'll talk about the intelligence side in a minute with Damien. But they come from investigating grand corruption, complex, organised crime, and looking at that global asset, picture, trying to understand who the UBO is, who the ultimate beneficial owner is of an asset hidden in the BVI that's, and attribute it to a chateau in the south of France or something like that, that sort of thing. That's bread and butter to us. Some of the stuff we've done in the past, we led the response to the Arab Spring. We did a lot of work there around the world, a lot of Nigerian corruption and many other cases. And where that translates to right now, corporate litigation, we're largely doing many of the similar cases, very big asset recovery, non-performing loan cases. We're dealing with a number of really high value frauds, which I'll explain about in a minute, the kind of problems people are facing. And that sort of threat to the companies, not just UK, but global based companies, the type of crimes that they're encountering and how to do, and we're supporting them in getting a legal resolution. I'll hand over to Damien, who'll talk about the intelligence side, I'm sure.
Thanks, Jonathan. Well, yeah, our story. Well, if Jonathan represents the more purist investigative expertise within our company, my role is defined by my familiarity with generating accurate and timely intelligence and then using that intelligence insight as a platform for decision making. So, that experience and methodology was central to the military operations that I was involved with during my earlier career. Previously in the context of finding terrorists or locating assets linked to state adversaries, and then using, all of the government intelligence architecture that was available to us. So, I come from a background of high risk decision making and risk mitigation in what followed. So now we have replicated those intelligence collection methods with everything from human expertise to imagery intelligence, open source intelligence in its many forms, from deep and dark web analysis, social media monitoring. We've fused that with cutting edge software platforms to be able to operate at near state level. So, it's the application, I suppose, of that skill set that I and my team bring to our partnership now. And I guess to answer your question, directly on heritage, that's hugely important really to who I am and how we now approach investigations together in the commercial sector. And if you'll indulge me, I'll give you 3 reasons why to try and help bring that to life. I think firstly, government work is a fantastic basis for understanding higher level intentions. So, being able to properly frame a problem and set the right mission with the right context, particularly with regard to making sure that any actions are coherent with legal and policy parameters. There are always constraints on what can be achieved and the manner in which you set about your work. So you have to understand that landscape and where you fit within it, so you understand the freedoms that you have if you want to be effective. So I think high level awareness is a really important sort of first principle. I think secondly, outputs. You have to be clear-eyed when it comes to delivering exactly what a client wants. And for us, with our background of government work, we are by our nature very outputs focused people. We try to establish quickly what a client is ultimately seeking to achieve. In some instances, we might provide some of that clarity, but then we deliver on those commitments, using all the available resources, taking care to be in tune with those legal and policy constraints. But it is about, the execution, the outcome, the end state. That is always the priority. And I think thirdly, just a brief word, on the how. We will certainly explore methodologies throughout this webinar series. But for now, I think suffice to say, this is fundamentally a team sport. It's never a solo endeavor when you're trying to deal with complexity. So, you shouldn't believe the lone wolf idea. That is a myth, and that applies to contractors as well. You've got to be greater than the sum of your parts to make sure you deliver excellence, every time, over time, and can build, meaningful relationships with clients. So having a multifunctional team of trained and experienced professionals is essential for that if you want to handle complexity. So, bringing all that together, I hope that gives you a flavour, of our story. John and I and our colleagues have built that cross-functional investigative team over the last 3 years, and we've come together around a common vision and ethos, one which emphasises, I suppose, integrity, pursuit of excellence, and trying to approach our work, in the only way we know how, which is to view those cases all as no-fail missions. So I think, the USP of the partnership, our story, is really summed up by the title of this series, Team, Tradecraft and Tech. That is the essence. So forgive me, Abby, that's quite an extended answer to your first question, but hopefully that sets the scene well before we explore other more technical aspects of tonight's topic.
Thank you so much, Damien. So that explains kind of where your individual aptitude lies and your specialist approach. Jonathan, can you tell me what exactly do you mean by complex investigations and the challenges that businesses face?
Of course, Abby. So what I propose doing is just kind of giving you, I will talk about complex investigations. I'll also talk about some of the problems we're seeing clients face at the moment. And I think some of the issues that government have raised, National Crime Agency and others, to say that these are really the sort of crimes that are being committed against our clients, against businesses, and therefore we need to have the right team. And Damien talks about that kind of specialist team and how we've woven it all together, having that right team ready to deal with it. And first of all, think about investigations. I always kind of, you're gonna have to forgive me, on this one, because whilst it is nearly gin and tonic time, and I'm not there, but I will have one definitely straight after this. I love the kind of fever tree analogy that 3/4 of your G&T is tonic. And I think actually that so much applies to investigation space, because, a big chunk of it is investigations and you've got to get it right. We're seeing quite often, we're picking cases up after a client has already instructed someone, they've got 6 months down the line, and then we're trying to sort of knit it back together and keep the wheels on and get it over the line, and that just can't be a cost-effective or sensible route. And I think thinking then about the type of team you need, you've got to think about the sort of crimes that are being committed at the moment. one thing we can say for absolutely sure in this pandemic, whilst we've all been getting used to working, you know, in our kitchen tables and all the rest of it, the criminals, the villains, were definitely not furloughed. Definitely not. You know, they have been super busy, and they are moving. The sensible ones, your all sensible organised crime criminals, all of them, they're moving away from anything that involves their kind of exposure in real terms. They're getting online, and everything from bounce back and business continuity loan frauds all the way to investment frauds. And if we just look at what's happening, like there's been a 94% increase in sort of criminals posing as legitimate organizations. So by that I mean everything from HMRC all the way through to pretending to be a well-established international investment firm, cloning their website and then basically stealing off people. We dealt with one, a Bitcoin one recently, and it was exactly that. I think most of you will have seen these things like these text messages that get you asking to pay £2 extra to parcel force because your parcel's overweight. Though that sort of crime is just growing exponentially. Interestingly, I read a really good piece that was in the FT, I think, actually, at the weekend, talking about money mules. And we used to see these, certainly when I was a senior detective at Scotland Yard, we'd see money mules as being young people that were their accounts being hijacked and being used to launder sort of dirty money from gangs and drugs and, you know, all that sort of stuff. Well, actually, that's changing as well. I mean, I'll get to talk about a case hopefully later, which involved 100 million, essentially. And a client was convinced they were entering into a legitimate deal. Over 9 months preparatory work to get to the point of that money moving. And actually, it's all a big scam. And that kind of investment fraud sort of is on the rise. And I can only say, if you're, you know, one would hope that if you're entering into something like that, you're already employing some pretty good due diligence to look at it. But if you've got the slightest suspicion, get somebody in to look at it, because actually the back end trying to recover 100 million is going to cost you a lot more. And it's, you know, some of the legal challenges you may face, which Sarah will talk about. And then I think finally, just talk, you know, about this kind of crime levels. Let's look at what's happened just with government money alone. Government money, like 75 billion borrowed on bounce back loans and business continuity loans. If you just go by the figures that the Cabinet Office have disclosed in the National Audit Office, they reckon roughly 5% is fraud. Many commentators think it's significantly more than that. 5% is 3.75 billion. We have 669,000 nurses in Great Britain. 70,000 have been looked after by Nicola Sturgeon. She's given them a pay rise. 600,000 haven't, or they've got a 1% pay rise for working their socks off for the last year. If we divide that 3.7 billion by those nurses, we'll be able to give them an 18.94% pay rise for 1 year. That's the amount of money that's been stolen from government, and the type of crime that's being committed and everything around that. Now that affects banks, obviously, it affects government, it affects our government, the British government, because it's backed by them. I think just a couple of other bits to think about in the type of crimes we're facing. NCA, the National Crime Agency even have issued some interesting alerts on independent schools and universities, a lot of focus on them of late for other matters. But for money laundering, another big push on money service bureaus, old, you know, it's an old problem. And I've read, you know, they also report that still 100 billion in money's moving through London. And I've read, in fact, today that the report about 200 million reported in suspicious activities through lawyers' accounts. If 100 billion in illicit money is moving through London, it's significantly more than 200 million is moving through lawyers' client accounts. I can tell you that categorically, because a lot of this you can't do without some legal support in place. So wouldn't be surprised if there's more focus on that going forward. And finally, the kind of due diligence space as well, very quickly to mention that. I think it's not going to change. You may have seen, you may have read over the weekend that the memorandum of understanding is almost there to be signed between London and Brussels, which basically means that there won't be any regulatory arbitrage between, but Britain's not going to suddenly deregulate significantly to bring business in. It can't do. It's going to be signing up to this MOU. So standards will still stay very high. So yes, whilst we're working from our kitchen tables and we're trying to sort of out there and look after our clients and fight crime and all the rest of it, there's a lot that we've got a lot to face, I think, over the next few years. Over to you, Abby.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. So Sarah, let's hear from you. So Jonathan raised the issue of conducting business remotely. Surely this must pose some legal considerations.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. I think the legal considerations to remote business can be looked at in two ways. Firstly, the impact on the courts, and secondly, the impact on undertaking the investigation. And I'll try and deal with each in turn, if I may. Inevitably, remote working has had an impact on how the courts do business. There's a lot of it being in the press, particularly in relation to jury trials, because they, of course, have been hit hardest. Not least because they will effectively came to a stop for much of last year. Now, the Crown Courts have now adapted amazingly. And so, for example, the jury are either socially distanced or they sit behind perspex dividers, and that the trials can continue. But there are, for example, strict rules about not handing out documents to the jury unless they haven't been touched for, in some cases, at least 48 hours beforehand. But there is an inevitable backlog of jury trials that now need to be cleared. There are a number of Nightingale courts that have sprung up to help with clearing that backlog, but that is going to take some time. And so the courts are having to quite properly prioritise those trials where the defendants are in custody. However, on the upside, whilst jury trials have inevitably suffered over the past 12 months, the court system, and particularly the family and the civil courts, adapted very quickly to having online directions hearings, and even to some extent, particularly in the commercial court, contested hearings. The same is now true in the criminal courts in relation to directions hearings and shorter hearings. And that has meant that a large percentage of court business has been undertaken relatively smoothly, and some might argue more efficiently than before, not least for those of us who have to travel, for example, to Leicester or to Nottingham or to Middlesbrough for what could have been quite literally a 10-minute hearing. That has been done all remotely, and as I say, arguably more efficiently. But in terms of the impact on investigations, in my view, actually, there's been very limited impact from a legal perspective. Yes, the way in which investigations have been undertaken has changed, so that, for example, witness statements are now being obtained either over the phone or via Zoom or some other similar technology. And some of the in-field investigations may have been curtailed. But in my experience, investigators, much like the court service, have shown themselves to be very forward-thinking in terms of how they have adapted, whilst also keeping in mind the important and essential principles that I think are relevant to all investigations. And by that I mean, for example, and it does mean coming back to the basics, but I think the basics are what helps all of us sometimes. So, for example, keep a record. Perhaps that's more important than ever when you're working remotely. Consider all lines of inquiry, whether or not that's for or against a potential defendant. Have a clear case strategy from the outset, but be prepared to adapt it. And I think all of those elements still apply and have applied, whether or not the investigation is being undertaken remotely or otherwise. I think another important consideration, and it's linked to this aspect, and it feeds back into what Jonathan was talking about a moment ago. But one of the areas of growth for criminals over the past year has been the increase in cybercrime. Now, there are various theories behind that, but one of them, which I think is quite interesting, is that one theory is that the increase is because of the number of people, the increase in the number of people working from home. And again, feeding on the human psychology in relation to that. Apparently, people are not so security conscious when working from home. So, for example, they haven't changed their passwords as frequently as they may have done if they were in the office, or they may be prone to click on that email that looks innocent and then turns out not to be. And so I guess the rather obvious point here is that if you're engaged or involved in any form of investigation that's being undertaken remotely, it's important to be super vigilant about your own IT security. Now, I know it sounds trite and perhaps a little obvious, but it's amazing how even lawyers, I say even lawyers, we also slip up in relation to IT. But I'm sure that's perhaps something that Jonathan can help a little bit more with.
So yeah, I mean, Sarah, you're absolutely right. It has moved online, and in moving online, I think also the other thing, the agility. We've all sort of got used to the fact that if you can live in the northeast of England, but actually your job's in London now, and it's easy to work because you can work remotely. The sort of criminals we're seeing, and what we're seeing now, is they just see the globe as one place. So actually, if you are a victim of this, and the type of team you need then to respond to it needs to be able to very quickly penetrate and get into the cyber side of it to understand where it's originating from. We had I mentioned the Bitcoin case, and within 24 hours we'd essentially followed it all the way to a building in Manila. And the client at that point said, I know exactly what's happened here, because that was where the vulnerability was. And so you do need that team that's kind of agile and got the right people. And one of the things that we're doing, and we find is increasingly sort of relevant, is to get people like the financial investigators who can look at the financial picture and understand, trace, not just tracing the assets, but tracing the actual money flow, and deal with large voluminous, material to particularly in a fraud or a asset recovery case. But we have them working directly with, and I think this is really important now, and it's something we kind of tried to do to some extent in the police. When I was in the police, I've left a few years ago now, but it was always still a little bit difficult because people were quite departmentalized, and building that, cross-discipline team where you bring in intelligence professionals as well. So you've got people who know how to do deep and dark web searches, how to run really complex social media monitoring. I don't just mean like searching across Facebook and all that. It's about bringing all that data back, but bringing it back in a format that can be understood. Because let's face it, even if you look at 5 people and their social media, you very quickly can end up with 25,000 pieces of information you're trying to sift through and work out. So you need the cyber capability. You need to think about, and this is, like Sarah said, the agility and what we've done. We've had to, ordinarily, you start a case, you'd all sit down together in an office, you'd debrief, you'd go off, and if there was a laptop, you'd go and pick it up in person. Well, we haven't been able to do any of that, but we've continued doing it in a different way. So creating secure cloud-based spaces for things like data rooms. So if you've got really, really complex fraud, you put hundreds of thousands of documents and pieces of emails and everything else like that in the data room, and you then use that as for your e-discovery. We set it up with an OCR, so we have an optical recognition to be able to search through it. We can access it, the client can access it, we can then both talk about a particular piece of information, the relevance of it, and then if necessary, if it start to sort of include that in things like witness statements. And again, sort of like the remote issue, we've got, ordinarily we'd have done things like travel, got on a plane, travel, taken a witness statement off somebody in a foreign country if they happen to be in another part of Europe or elsewhere. Well, we've sat down now and done 100-page plus witness statements for really complex cases in sections, just breaking them down like you would do, like a normal sort of, if you were doing a witness debrief in my former life. Sometimes even recording it so that then we can go back and play back and check. So you don't have to have somebody literally online for extended periods every day, which can be quite intrusive and difficult to do. And finally, there is the sort of issue of there's the more kind of hands-on bit about investigations. It's been a bit of a challenge, I would admit, but again, we've got around it. Is recruiting, speaking to people. We all know if there's a complex corporate matter, there may well be somebody in the middle of all that decides they're not going to follow whatever the party line that's been agreed, and they want to break out and they want to seek some cover and they want to tell people exactly what happened. So bring in how we manage whistleblowers and managing a whistleblower, importantly, in respect of the jurisdiction that they're in, where they sit, where they reside, and then making sure we sort of sit with someone like Sarah very earlier on. She's advising us as to how we can manage that. And then I'd sort of finally say the bit about having a decent intelligence collection going on in the background, and this is part of why we actually put Prevail and Intelligence Sanctuary together. It's all well and good setting off, going and starting this investigation, sitting there doing your interviews, sifting through lots of keyword searches, etc., and on data up in the cloud. But actually, the world has changed, and the type of information that is available is popping up every single second, and it's out there. So you need to have a system that's a sophisticated, intelligence-led system that's in the background, that's picking everything up, because you just don't know. I can genuinely say, and I can't talk about the case because it would be inappropriate to do so, but something came up on social media today that may have identified a critical witness in a case that we're dealing with. So if you haven't got that system set up that's scraping and constantly monitoring and saying to you, right, here you would miss it. So kind of where all that comes together, we're seeing a big increase in private prosecutions. Maybe that's just because we're getting asked to do more and more of them, but I think it's a really interesting space, because often we just basically have to put our police hats on and carry on as detectives as we would do. But it's an interesting area, and I'm sure Sarah will be able to sort of talk more technically about what we need to consider as we move into that sort of space now more so, especially I'll just add, because think about all those frauds and everything I told you about and everything that the government's got to deal with. Police resources haven't increased. So who's going to pick it? Who's going to pick this up? Who's going to deal with these crimes?
Thank you, Jonathan. When you say private prosecutions, some of the audience will be familiar, others less so. Sarah, why are they of note in today's COVID area? And what are they for, and what's changed?
Yeah, thanks, Abby. In fact, a lot of people would have read, in fact, that private prosecutions have been in the press a lot over the last few weeks, largely as a result of the appeals that are currently going through the Court of Appeal in relation to some of the convictions that were obtained following the private prosecutions that were undertaken by the Post Office a number of years ago. Now, there are particular features in relation to the Post Office prosecutions that arguably make them unique. But the fact that private prosecutions can go so horribly wrong should perhaps serve as a bit of a warning shot in terms of underlying how important it is to get them right. So what is a private prosecution? Well, most people will be aware of the usual way in which a case gets prosecuted. The police investigate it, they supply the evidence to the Crown Prosecution Service, who then advise on the most appropriate charge, and the matter then proceeds through the court system. But with counsel, so barristers usually only being brought in at the Crown Court stage to actually prosecute the case. But that's not the only way to bring someone to justice through the criminal courts. All individuals and all companies have a statutory right to bring a private prosecution. And perhaps, as Jonathan's just highlighted, perhaps because of limited police resources, there has been a steady increase in the number of such cases, particularly over, I'd say, about the last 5 years. And especially in the area of fraud. And again, I agree entirely with Jonathan here, that I think one of the primary reasons for that is that the police simply don't have the manpower or the time to devote to large-scale, complex fraud investigations. And so they'll opt for, if I dare call them, the low-hanging fruit instead. But that's not to say that private prosecutions are limited to cases of fraud, quite the contrary. From my own cases, I've been involved in private prosecutions for trademark offences, again, largely as a result of the fact that local authorities simply don't have the resources to prosecute, for example, the selling of a fake Mulberry bag, Computer Misuse Act offences, and even bizarrely bigamy. But I would agree that most of my private prosecution work, and increasingly so, centres around fraud. Now, whether it be fraud on a charity, in which the charity are the prosecutor, which we're seeing more of, or fraud on an employer by an employee, where the employer is the prosecutor, the range is vast. But the route through the court process is pretty much exactly the same, whether you are a private prosecutor or a state one. So the evidence is obtained by the investigators, it's reviewed by solicitors and stroke or counsel, and the charge is then decided upon. You then have to make an application to the magistrate's court for the summons to be issued. Now, in some cases, that can be a straightforward process, but in other cases, you may need to justify, either in writing or at a hearing, why the case should be brought. And I think one of the things that can particularly help at this stage is if you are able to satisfy the court that when deciding on the charge, you had in mind something called the Code for Crown Prosecutors. Now, that is the code that all CPS lawyers have to address and consider when advising on charge. And essentially, it means that they have to be satisfied about two things. Firstly, that the prosecution is in the public interest, and secondly, that there is a reasonable prospect of conviction. Now, having an eye on that test, that code, both at the outset and obviously recording the decision and the reason for it, and then revisiting it throughout your prosecution, it is likely to ensure that a prosecution is not being brought by an individual or a company, either vexatiously or inappropriately. And by the same token, having that code in mind can be useful to consider whether an offer to settle the case is, for example, appropriate, because it may be that once you get your case through the courts or into court, you may find, for example, that an employee subsequently offers to repay the money that they have stolen. Now, that may, for example, make you rethink whether or not the prosecution remains in the public interest. Now, there's no doubt at all that undertaking a private prosecution is not without its challenges. For example, the ability to attain some evidence is not as straightforward if you're not a police officer. One obvious example is in the obtaining of bank statements. A police officer can simply apply to the court for a production order to obtain a defendant's bank statements if it's considering particular offences, particularly money laundering. But that power is not available to a private prosecutor. And so different court applications have to be used. It's all perfectly possible, but you just have to be a little bit more imaginative about it. By the same token, you also have to think carefully about the nature of the evidence that you're wanting to adduce. And this feeds back on from what Jonathan said a moment ago. Do you want to, for example, rely on a whistleblower? If you do, then you of course have to bear in mind that they can't be given any formal protection akin to, say, a police informant, but you may be able to apply for the court to protect their identity in due course. Another obvious example relates to covert recordings, which are used a lot in private prosecutions. And again, a lot of the investigators that I work with are ex-police officers. And so they understand the rules that surround intrusive activity as a result of RIPA. And whilst they're not strictly subject to RIPA because they're not police officers, they still abide by it in order to ensure that the evidence is not ruled inadmissible in due course. And it no doubt goes without saying, but ensuring that you undertake the investigation properly, and just as importantly, undertake the disclosure process properly, is likely to mean that the case runs smoothly once it gets into the court system. It also means that your case is less likely to be taken over by the CPS in due course, because it is perhaps right to highlight that any defendant in a private prosecution has the right to invite the CPS to take a case over and then prosecute it or even discontinue it. Now, if the CPS are approached to do that, then they have to seek a response from the private prosecutor before making a decision. And if, of course, you're able to reassure the CPS that everything has been done to the same standard that they and the police would have worked to, then the risk of your case being taken over is reduced. Now, of course, and I'll just end on this point, Abby, if I may, of course, an important consideration to anybody contemplating litigation, whether in the civil or criminal courts, is their cost exposure. Now, at the moment, private prosecutions have a fairly unique status in that if you are a successful prosecutor, you are entitled to make an application to recover your costs from both the convicted defendant and also from the state. Now, the recovery from the state, and in particular, the level at which those costs can be recovered at, is currently the subject of a parliamentary review. If I was a betting person, I would say that those costs are likely to be reduced, not eliminated, but reduced. But certainly for the time being, it remains the position that you are entitled to make an application for your full costs, effectively from the state, from what's called central funds. But what about if the private prosecution is unsuccessful? Well, in those circumstances, and again, perhaps rather uniquely, provided it can be shown that the prosecution was not started or continued unreasonably, then you may be able to recover the cost of the prosecution from the state. But of course, the flip side is that if the court finds that it was continued unreasonably or even started unreasonably, then you may be liable to pay the wasted costs of the other side. And I think the cost implications perhaps link into the strategy that has to be in place, and that if Damien can help us in relation to that.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I mean that's really invaluable technical insight, and I think there is a real commercial point here too, because more complexity can mean more cost if you haven't got the right strategies in place. So I think there's a real need to be able to anticipate and manage the risks. Part of that includes being very clear on the evidential standards. You have to get that right. But I think from a sort of intelligence and investigators perspective, practically there are measures one can employ to try and simplify that complexity, really. So we often use phases as an example, so that it becomes very clear what's going to be delivered, by when, what the challenges are, what the benefits will be, and then how risks are being mitigated, whilst all the time being transparent on the costs within each of those phases. Because I think, crucially, that helps to keep the client in the driving seat of the cost envelope and on the project deliverables. That I think is an essential component of trying to navigate some of this complexity. And I guess to elaborate on a theme from earlier that we've touched on a couple of times here, we do see real value in using multidisciplinary teams as a way of navigating that complexity. And both of us have spoken about trained professionals. And I guess for me, what I mean here is, each person being a specialist in their area, of course, but actually it's more than that. Part of the, I suppose, collective magic is being able to integrate them effectively to really be able to pull apart a problem. So to be able to, I guess, examine, a real network, the connections, to be able to link people to companies or transactions, and then to link that activity to a time and place, or to fix an asset geographically. Those types of skills aren't everyday skills, and in our experience, they are different from forensic accountancy or a standard investigator's tool set. However valid and however experienced those individuals are. So I guess this is about trying to use the full armory that's available to you, and then operating effectively across the seams and the silos. Because that's really the only way that you can genuinely think to the finish, with the right strategies and try and deal with those complexities. And we've certainly seen that in some of our recent cases, which probably, Jonathan, you're best placed to elaborate on.
Yeah. So some sort of recent examples, some recent kind of vignettes, and also just some, I'd say, some thoughts to consider in current times. I keep coming back to the kind of fraud and investment fraud and that sort of thing. There's a huge amount of that we're picking up. Obviously, a lot of the asset recovery, and on the investment fraud, the bit about being strategic from the outset and getting that right team, so the right investigation team. But often, what we find also works quite well. I mean, we work with law firms, but we can also work under direct instruction with counsel, and often in there you almost build this team of, you've got counsel leading from the front and leading on the legal strategy, and then right next to them we're saying, right, investigation wise, this is where we reckon we can get to, this is what we think we've reasonably be able to obtain or understand, and then that can ensure that it fits, then the client's expectations are set properly, and also the right legal avenue is pursued. And just some of these kind of property investment frauds and things like that we've been dealing with, what we've done is, one of the first things we've done, and it's slightly reversed from really the policing environment, is taken a very quick but decent look at the suspect's sort of financial position, because our client is, yes, they want justice, but they actually want their money back. So do they have the assets Are they realizable? Are they in jurisdictions that are realizable? It's exactly the same for the big non-performing loans. Are they in jurisdictions that we're likely to be able to get enforce orders against them? We're going to be able to attribute the asset to them despite it being under a complex global structure, maybe a number of companies in the BVI, but we can say yes. And the other sort of area that we're you know, on that point around the attribution, what I would say as well is, yes, it's the bane of our lives, if we're really honest, the whole thing about beneficial ownership and hidden corporate structures. And we've got to wait till 2023 when the BVI's register will become open, and slowly, you know, I was working on this in 2013 with officials before the locker and G8, and it's still a door we're desperately trying to push open. But think about the other ways that you can use technology to understand people's travel patterns, their locations. Are they located at a certain residence for extended periods? Are there family members? You know, we've done this and then looked at people and gone, well, hang on a minute. It's very hard for you to say that £25 million beautiful house in the suburbs of Paris is not yours, because you and your family seem to spend an awful lot of time there. It might be hidden under, and that's the other area we're picking up on, and we're, you know, we really enjoy this sort of work is, and it's not going, I don't think this is going to slow down, is NGOs taking a much more proactive approach around their investigations and taking it beyond exposure to actually sanctions. Right, we go in, investigate Central African crimes of, you know, corruption, high-level corruption involving international corporates and politicians, and gather all the evidence so that we can actually either get them sanctioned or even prosecuted. And there's a big push by a number of NGOs to sort of move down that more proactive line, and it's we're getting heavily involved in it. But you know, bring it back to the fact that there's sort of challenges and technical challenges that we're still going to face in current times, and I do think. I've said this point already, but law enforcement are really going to struggle. So we need to think about how we respond. If you're a victim or think you're a victim, about getting people in really, really quickly. It could save you a lot of money. Thinking about actually how we're coping, working remotely. One thing I would actually say with confidence is where to bring a team together previously might have taken a few days because you're bringing people from different locations. We're so used to now literally plugging in, going through the screens of our computer, getting the right people together, that you can almost do it in 5 minutes, not, you know, in days. So that I think is a plus. And kind of on that technical point of where we are and what we're doing, I'll just hand over to Damien, conscious of time.
Yeah, I am too. I was quite keen. It'll be one for another day, I think, where we can perhaps talk about one of our fraud cases, which has a real, you know, national security dimension to it, which we're both quite passionate about. But we'll definitely have to sort of push that, I think, into webinar 2. But I think one of the sort of technical points that is worth just drawing out whilst we've got Sarah here is, you know, is this point about the need for admissible evidence, because when we were first engaging with legal firms and talking about our capabilities and developing the showcases and making sure that we had all of the legal and policy constraints down pat, it really kind of came back to us that there were firms out there who just got this wrong, and so they were very good at finding things, but none of it could be taken forward as a legal case. And I think, you know, we touched on private prosecution. So I wonder briefly, Sarah, whether you could just use your expertise really to just put that point to bed.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely, Damien. I think it's a great issue, and one of the key ways in which you can increase the likelihood of success in either a private prosecution or civil fraud litigation is knowing the difference between intelligence and admissible evidence, and knowing what you have to do to make it admissible. Quite frankly, there's simply no point compiling a case on intelligence or third-hand witness statements if a judge, either in the civil or the criminal courts, that takes a view that further down the line that evidence is simply not admissible. And so the key, it seems to me, to ensuring success is knowing the difference and being aware that the intelligence should essentially act as a springboard to shape the investigation in terms of gathering and compiling admissible evidence. And again, it might seem obvious, but it comes back to what I was saying before, that one of the checks and balances to be applied when obtaining that admissible evidence is to consider what rules apply to the police in this scenario, and how can I ensure that I abide by them? Because if you don't know, or have investigators on your case who don't know, then it seems to me that you run a real risk that a judge in due course is likely to rule the evidence inadmissible. And so all of the emotional and financial effort that's gone into the investigation could well and truly be wasted. And of course, again, the obvious point is that if you're not sure as an investigator or as someone involved in these cases, then ask. And again, perhaps it sounds a little trite, but know your limits. Because again, there's no point taking a risk on behalf of a client and hoping that material that you're in possession of is in due course going to be admissible. You need to ensure that it will be, if you're going to have any possible likelihood of getting your case home.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So, Jonathan, perhaps you can just touch on briefly how these problems can be addressed, and have we changed for good?
Yeah, I think we definitely have changed for good. I think we've got a lot slicker. I think we recognise the multidisciplinary element of it, certainly in the private sector. Be strategic, plan that's client focused. You know, we can really think through the options. Often these are multi-jurisdictional, so they give, you know, Sarah or whoever we're working with will be able to may sort of think through the appropriate route for a legal strategy. And I'd just be kind of one point I'd really stress. I know I've made the G&T comment about Fever Tree, but it is so important. It is a big chunk of your case. A big part of it is that investigation, you know. Exactly like Fever Tree have been successful in increasing their sales. You know, I would just stress the point that it's just get that team right, whoever they are, get it right, that they know how to prepare the evidence to the right standard, so they don't, you know, you win your case.
Thank you. So now it's time for a few questions, a bit of Q&A. So you mentioned earlier bounce back loans, and we have had a question on it. So do you have a view on the government's bounce back loan scheme? It seems there is opportunity for fraud here. Wondered if you could consider that to be a real problem.
Do you want me to have a go at that? Because I've been quite vocal about it on so look, there are two things here. These are unprecedented times. I think take the politics out of it. The Chancellor had no choice but to make fast and bold decisions, and many of my former colleagues, civil servants, have worked incredibly hard over the last year, because just to try and save businesses, they had to get cash out there. And when you're doing it on that scale, it just was very challenging. I think the first month, if you looked at it, you could apply to any number of 18 banks if you were a criminal, and you could get the maximum amount from every single one. It wasn't until after a month there was a system put in place that the banks talked to each other and said, well, hang on a minute, he's already gone to HSBC, he can't have one from Barclays. But it is always going to be fraud. I've seen it myself. I've seen, like, literally hundreds of companies or companies on a shelf, really, that are doing nothing, and suddenly they're applying for a loan. And I think it's but that's the same. We've seen it not just in bounce back loans, business continuity loans. We've seen it right across all of the financial packages that have offered, you know, takeaways that suddenly had 100 seats, you know, 100 seats in their takeaway too, and they were claiming for the restaurant scheme. You know, the list goes on. Sadly, there's bad people out there that exploited it. You know, and I don't know if that answers it. Abby? Well, that's more of a statement. My political statement.
Thank you.
It was a massive opportunity for fraud, and it's a really complex problem now trying to get that money back, because the responsibility sits with banks for a while and then it goes to the government. I
think sorry, just to interrupt, I think we've probably got time just for one more question this evening, Abby.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, there's one just come in. Damien, maybe you could answer this one. We have, I'm a student at UCL studying security studies. What advice would you give to graduate students eager to undertake a career in this sector?
Yeah, well, I think this is probably one that Sarah might have a view on as well. But I guess from my perspective, if you're doing a security studies sort of course, then that in itself is a great foundation. What you probably need is to get some exposure really around the sector to try and work out where you might fit and where your particular interest lies really. I would say a good place to start is perhaps something like the RUSI Financial Crime Insights sort of series. There's a fantastic podcast, and then generally sort of RUSI is very informative collective generally. There's a lot of real sort of thought leadership there, particularly some of the angles that we are interested in, like the sort of national security dimension of fraud, cyber security and some of the policy issues around that. That's quite a good sort of top level way of gaining exposure. I would say at a level below that, come and chat to us really. We can probably help point you in the right direction, because there are a number of different components to it, and we've got a good overview of that. So hopefully that may be sort of part one of the answer. Sarah?
Yeah, no, I endorse everything that you said, Damien. I think the other thing to bear in mind as well, and a question is particular to post-COVID era, I wouldn't rule out things like the government agencies, so in particular the NCA, in terms of gaining skills and just improving your CV in terms of exposure to that kind of experience, because the NCA in particular did an awful lot of interesting work in this area. Clearly, if you're interested in doing the private work, then that's different. And as Damien says, I'd take him up on his offer to go and have a conversation with him. But I certainly wouldn't rule out government sector either for, as I say, improving your CV and in entering the job market.
Thank you, Sarah. So it actually looks like we are nearing the end of the session this evening. Are there any final points you'd like to address to conclude today's webinar? Jonathan, should we start with you?
Yeah, I just think to summarise, we know times have changed. We know we're going to operate differently. We're going to be much more agile. I think really interesting to hear the points come out about the defence review recently, and about how the military is changing, something much more closer to Damien's heart really, and his heritage. But the fact that things are going to get much more slicker, much more agile in the cyberspace. And that's where we need to be as investigators. We really, really do. You need people that can within seconds start to work out the trail, because it may well disappear. I would also stress the final point that we are, because the level of sort of crime that we're seeing increased, particularly the types of frauds, etc., then please, 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 if you think something's happening, or it doesn't smell right, get somebody to come in early and have a look for you, because then trying to do the back end asset recovery is an expensive and challenging exercise.
Yeah, and I think on my side, yeah, absolutely would complement those sentiments, I suppose, with just a final word on risk, really. I think it can be attractive to try to minimise investment in investigations at the front end, in particular. And whilst obviously you do need to be in control of budgets and ensure value for money, my experience has sort of taught me really that the quicker you can be oriented to a problem, the easier it is to understand the complexity and see the pathway through it. And you're much better placed to be able to perceive upcoming risks, so you can stay ahead of them. And I think, for us, we've deliberately drawn on our heritage to position ourselves as a team with the right skills and approach to provide that sort of insight. And what we try to do, I guess, is show how the pieces of the puzzle can fit together, and indeed which pieces are missing, so that you can see how success can be orchestrated. So I guess it usually helps to draw us in early to help frame the problem and shape the outcomes and the development of the case, because that's definitely my experience. You know, it becomes much more cost effective, it better mitigates the commercial risks, and ultimately it provides a superior outcome for the client.
Great, thank you so much. And we, of course, look forward to exploring some of those themes with you next time in webinar 2, which is AI-enabled asset tracing. So thank you, of course, to Jonathan Benton and Damien Huntingford Obe, and a huge thanks to our special guest, Sarah Woods, for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.